national planning policy framework rather than being a lift of the wording from the framework.
Yeah.
In this case, and it's a similar approach you see sometimes in greenbelt authorities where instead of having a suite of greenbelt policies, it's simply that greenbelt matters will be dealt with according to national policy. That's clear. So I'm just wondering whether, I mean, in some cases I've raised concerns with policies like this and suggested that they are actually removed from the plan where an attempt was made to parrot national policy. But is this a case that it reflects it? And as we've discussed today, it moves on a little bit from that and dealing with matters that aren't specifically allocated in the plan. Does that give you some comfort that there's some flexibility here that would allow for a change in national policy? Mr. Green, anything else you would want to add?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay. Anything, Mr. Sturgis? Okay, so it's the nature of these discussions and actually the previous discussion on this program that is perhaps left me to a different place than I was expected to be in terms of policy as well. So it's all a journey, isn't it? So quality and new development, Mr. Sturgis, are you going to pick that one up, please?
Going to do that one, yes. I suppose the first question here is the 112 one, which talks about does it take account of the revised framework which was published in July this year. In particular, does any explanation in the policy and reference to the creation of beautiful places mean that the policy is inconsistent with the framework? And I'd just like the Council's view on should the opening sentence specifically refer to the bullet points as the criteria by which beautiful and high quality developments will be assessed. I think that's my first point on this area. So come to the Council first.
Yeah. Our view is that the policy is suitably up to date. It incorporates requirements about design, coding and so on that are set out in paragraphs 126 to 129 of the framework. I suppose, yes, and that's where we specifically mentioned the word beautiful, but we think it goes far enough.
I think my point was, I think in terms of the bullet points, I think you're right. I think it was whether in that opening paragraph before the bullet points, that was just amended in order to say that these are the criteria by which you would define whether a development is high quality or beautiful.
I'm sure we could do that, sir.
Or is that something that you would intend to lead to the development management process?
I think, in the sense that it's you've got the criteria here. I mean, there's an element of subjectivity about this, isn't there? Which development management process would have to take into account. Yes.
Yeah, I suppose where I'm getting to is does the policy offer sufficient guidance to the development management process? So it enables the decision maker to react to the properties of the development proposal.
Okay. Yes, we think it's sufficiently clear, but obviously if there is an issue about that, we can give that some consideration.
It would be useful, especially in that first paragraph, which then references the bullet points in terms of, if you like, a set of criteria which is how high quality development will be assessed.
Yeah. Okay, so
Next point on this 112 is, and it'll come up as well in the design, because I was mentioned there. It's again the issue of street trees, and should one of the bullet criteria be referred to the establishment of street trees as a characteristic of useful high quality development. I know we do refer to it in the end of the design policy option, but again it's really looking at the consistency of these policies with the revised framework and the if you like, the heightened importance of the revised framework gives to street trees.
okay, so yes, because I think as you pointed out, we're thinking of adding, well, we're proposing to add a main modification to policy 3 to ensure that streets are tree lined.
Yeah.
Which was what you were referring to, presumably, sir. But
Yeah.
I don't.
It's just that, as I think we said earlier, there is overlap between these policies.
Yeah.
There's always going to be between placemaking and design. And again, because of the heightened importance that street trees are given in the revised version of the framework, it's whether one of the criteria, if we accept that the criteria in policy 2 are how high quality development should be judged.
Yes.
Then if high quality development means having street trees, then should the criteria be in there to reflect.
Okay, so we could certainly give that some consideration as well.
Having heard the discussion, I think it would be worth reflecting upon what each of the policies are trying to do, and is there actually a need for policies, 2 separate policies, in terms of placemaking and design. I know there's also policy about amenity and layout, but there's nothing wrong with having separate policies, but I think it's really trying to prevent some of that duplication between the policies and the clarity in terms of what each is trying to achieve if they remain separate. That might be an overall consideration to bear in mind.
We can consider that as well, on the basis, I suppose, that good placemaking and design are part and parcel of the same process.
I think, again, just picking up Mr. Lewis's point, it's that those 2 opening paragraphs of policy 2 and policy 3, if they could be made a bit more specific about one is to do with placemaking and one is to do with design, and then that then leads into the criteria that are underneath. I can see why 2 policies would be needed, but it's making sure that they both serve a specific purpose.
Okay, so yes, we can certainly look into that policy to clarify those matters.
So could I just raise one general point, and it'll place for other policies. The Council is keen, rather than bullet points in the final version of the plan, to have either revenue rules or letters for each of the bullet points, and we're proposed to deal with that by way of an additional modification rather than main modification. Are you content that it be dealt with as an additional modification rather than main modification?
I would be, but I'll also get Mr.
It's simply to make it easier when, in due course, references to policies are made in the reports to committee.
The only concern I would have is that as soon as you start not doing anything, then it becomes a hierarchy, and I'm not convinced that one of these is higher in the pecking order.
No, it may be that A, B, C, D is better than 1, 2, 3.
I think so.
There wouldn't be any other substantive change.
If there was no change to a policy, and no other change at all, yes, it could be an additional modification because it's not changing how a policy would be interpreted or used. If policies are being changed, I see no harm with actually including that in the main modification. Is it strictly necessary for soundness? No, but I think it's, in terms of completeness, it can be, or there could be just a single additional modification that sets out the bullet points have been replaced by a system of lettering.
Yeah, that's fine.
Just consistent throughout. I mean, it's
we can do that.
It's just how I think we would look very carefully to see what actually would precede that. So, for example, placemaking says, locally distinct centre place by, and then it goes to the bullet points. And if there's any changes to that, and then you have a sort of numbering changes and additions of ors and ands, etc. along the way, that can then potentially change the meaning of the policy. But it's where the policy meaning can change. It's just calling something A instead of a bullet point is not changing the meaning, is it? So
We don't anticipate there'll be any substantive change. That isn't the
No.
intent. It's simply just say for ease of reporting in due course in
Yeah.
committee reports.
yeah, and ease for inspectors undertaking section 78
Absolutely,
appeals
yes.
too.
Just generally usability.
Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah. We'll support that and we'll cover it off one way or the other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir.
But it could be, I say, it could just be a sweeping additional modification that all bullet points shall be replaced, provided there's no sort of hierarchy or other things in some of the policies. Policies aren't all written by the same person. We all have different ways of doing things,
Yeah.
even whether they're not together. So,
Yeah.
okay, cool.
Okay. What I'll do is I've got one more point on policy 2, which I want to get some clarification on, and then I'll come to the HBF's reaction if they've got any, because I do note that policy 2 wasn't one of the policies that you were concerned with. So in terms of 113 about the policy being clearly written and unambiguous, I wanted to get some clarification on accessibility in this context, because easily accessible could mean that it is referring to people with disabilities, or it could mean it's referring to accessibility for facilities needed for day-to-day living, or it could be a general sustainability criteria. So it's really about ensuring that the bullet point is very clear about what it means by being easily accessible.
Okay. Yes, so the intention was, I think that we wanted it to be accessible by everyone, and that we were concerned that facilities were accessible by walking, cycling, and where appropriate, public transport. And it follows our sort of, not only because it's important that these facilities are usable by local people, but also that we're trying to facilitate active, healthy lifestyles and so on, and as part of the sort of the wider sort of health thread, as much as anything else, health and inclusivity that runs through the plan.
So in terms of what you just said then, is it proposed then to include words in that bullet point 2, which says, for instance, incorporating accessible facilities by walking, cycling, where appropriate, public transport for day-to-day living? Is that
We've proposed main modification 0D, which goes most of the way to that. It talks about these facilities should be designed in a manner which is easily accessible by the local population by walking, cycling, or by using public transport. That's in the supporting text.
Yeah. I just wondered whether that, in terms of, I can understand why put it in the supporting text, is whether just by adding a few words to the policy, it could make it a lot clearer.
We could certainly give that some consideration.
The alternative approach would be to add in the explanatory text. It's a cross-reference to policy 32, which is about design sustainable transport and travel, which sets out the detailed requirements for developments.
Yes, sir.
I've read the plan.
Certainly, policy 32 is a comprehensive set of criteria there. And
Yes.
I think, that following on what Mr. Lewis has said, I think a reference in that bullet point to cross-reference 32 will certainly pick up my point. I've read the plan as well, by the way.
We'll look into that.
Yeah, this gives a thought as to whether it would be effective to put it within the policy or within the
justification given the coverage of policy 32, I think.
Okay, thank you. Would Ms Green, would you like to come back on any of the discussion that you've heard? And bearing in mind this isn't one of the policies that you've indicated the HBF are interested in.
Thank you. I think most of the discussion was about policy 2, which
It was.
you haven't made any comments on.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to policy 3, which is design. Which again, I've got a couple of questions for council. The first one was about street trees, and it was about whether or not that paragraph right at the end, the penultimate paragraph, whether that should be turned into a main bullet point, whether numbered or not, in order to show that schemes that are well designed have street trees incorporated within them.
Okay, so yes, I can see your point. We can give that some consideration, I think.
And then in terms of that one as well, I think in terms of one of the points that the council made in the proposed modifications, should the policy make it clear that the council requires all buildings to be adaptable for new uses throughout their lifetime?
Yes.
I think it basically it fits in with the bullet point 1, where it says incorporates sustainable design of the
Yes,
building
and also
process.
yeah, and also I suppose bullet point 2 as well, which talks about adaptability.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting something more overt, sir?
Certainly in terms of making sure that, that where possible, I suppose that buildings will be adaptable throughout their lifetime. Yes, I probably am suggesting something more overt.
Okay, so we can certainly look into that.
And then what I'll do is I'll probe the next question, the question around the building for life, building for a healthy life. Because I think what we were, and before I come on to the HBF on this one, I think what we were concerned about here was to just make sure that any ambiguity around what the council were looking for is actually addressed. So to pick up the HBF's point, is it a certification that you're looking for, or is it just to ensure that any proposals completed self-assessment, and therefore is any main modification necessary to ensure that the decision maker would know how to react to the proposal? So just how hard is the requirement, and what is the council looking for?
Okay, so yes, we're looking at doing the self-assessment, not the certification, and the intention is we're looking at a further modification, firstly to paragraph 5.5 of the plan, to explain the building for healthy life criteria that need to be met in order to be eligible to apply for commendation, as a further change to MMOD 0. So the intention is to say something along the lines that there are 12 criteria which need to be taken into account in the areas of design and placemaking. 12 considerations include elements such as natural connections, well-defined streets and spaces. Forgive me, you don't notice when you speak.
Just making sure people on the
Yeah.
microphones can hear what's being said as well.
Yeah. The 12 considerations include elements such as natural connections, well-defined streets and spaces and green infrastructure. And we go on to explain that to be eligible for a Building for a Healthy Life commendation, the development needs to secure at least 9 green lights out of 12 considerations and no red lights as they're known. So then in policy 3 we'd be looking at proposing a further amendment to main modification 0C to reference a Building for a Healthy Life assessment needing to be included in any design and access statement to demonstrate that the proposal is capable of achieving Building for a Healthy Life commendation. Implicit in this is that we're now proposing not to go ahead with main modification 0B.
Could you just give me that last one again? A reference in the text to for a Building for a Healthy Life assessment in the design and access statement to achieve a healthy life commendation.
Yeah, and then obviously implicit in that is that we would not propose to go ahead with modification 0B. I'm just checking I've got the facts right there. Let's just have a look at the policy again. Yes, we'd need to amend that because that last bullet point, as modified, talks about Building for a Healthy Life certification, and actually what we need to do is to, because we've said all this, that bullet point needs to be taken out, doesn't it? So, I think.
Right, so you take out this achieve the Building for a Healthy Life certification, and that will be replaced by text.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thanks. I need to come on to
Yes,
Mr. Lewis.
I just
I'll bring in the HBF.
yeah, maybe bring in the HBF notes. I'm just wondering about clarity as to whether which council is trying to achieve. So
Can I bring Ms. Green on this point? I hope you've been able to hear the discussions with the disturbance outside.
That would be policy, not text.
Sorry. We lost the sound part of the way through the discussion about Building for a Healthy Life. But I think I understood at the end there that is the council saying that the intention is now to remove the bullet point completely, and that there will be reference to Building for a Healthy Life in the supporting text, which was that understanding correct, or are the council still proposing modification MMOD0C?
But bearing in mind we did lose some sound there, could you just say what you said to me earlier?
Of course, yeah. So in terms of policy 3, what we're looking to do is to propose a further amendment to make reference to a Building for a Healthy Life assessment needing to be included in any design and access statement to demonstrate that the proposal is capable of achieving a Building for a Healthy Life commendation.
Right. So that's a further change to MMOD0C. Our issue with we were happy with the original modification, but our concern about if you want to refer to a commendation. Building for a Healthy Life is a self-assessment. If you want a developer to achieve a commendation, that involves the developer having to pay a fee and apply for assessment by a third party, and that we would say that that's sort of asking for more than just a self-assessment, and it's not something that has been included in the viability assessment, the cost of the fee. So we would not support the latest proposal that the council is putting forward.
I have a specific question on that, and it was the wording you appear to be using in terms of the modification to the text, and it was those words capable of meeting the. It seemed to me you weren't asking for a commendation. You were just asking for the evidence that it would be capable of achieving accommodation. How would you get to that if you weren't actually asking the applicant to go through the process of getting the accommodation?
Okay, so
is the capability in-house, or would you be using a sort of third party yourself to do that, or would you be expecting the applicant to have done that before they submit? It comes to a matter of clarity, I suppose.
yes, okay. So I mean, the intention behind this was because we wanted the applicant to sort of be clear that they would be capable of achieving that commendation, but clearly we didn't want what we didn't want to do was to incur fees for the applicant.
So again, just go back to my question then, would you expect the applicant to, if you like, self-assess themselves to see whether they would be capable of meeting that accreditation, so therefore they wouldn't incur the fee?
Correct, sir.
Yeah.
Just on that point of self-assessment, I mean, the framework encourages the use of these tools. This is one of the number of tools that could be used, I suppose. My concern, I think, might be that the change to the policy may imply some sort of compulsion, and if someone doesn't do that, would they then fall as being inconsistent with the policy? And is really should the policy be encouraging the self-assessment as part of the approach, as Mr. Sturgis was saying, rather than implying some sort of compulsion that it has to be done? This is the issue, but there should be. It's really achieving the things that Building for Life or Building Health Life certification is setting out to do. So development shall be designed to do, and
yes, sir.
Applicants will be encouraged to undertake a self-certified Building for Life or Building Health Life assessment. But it's really what it's trying to do is what the land use policy thing is, rather than the process of assessing it.
Yes.
I think that's really what the policy should be aiming to do, because if it falls to an appeal before, say, Mr. Sturgis or I, we would be looking at the effects of development.
Okay, yes, I think we were just, I mean, the intention was to ensure that that process was gone through. I think the commendation was really because we wanted buildings to, because of this sort of thread that's running through the plan about, you know, healthy and active lifestyles and healthy living, and, you know, emphasis on space standards and so on. We wanted, we think it's important that the plan does, you know, aim for high quality development, and this was one of the ways we saw of achieving it without putting, you know, excessive burdens on people.
So the aim is equality. That's one of the aims, and one of the ways to do that would be a form of self-assessment, such as this method.
Yes.
And it's really phrasing that, isn't it? I'm really just trying to, I think our questions are trying to get to the heart of what you're trying to achieve here in terms of policy.
Would it be helpful, sir, if we kind of went away and came up with something that might look a bit clearer to you, sirs?
Yeah, and I think the point that Mr. Lewis is making about setting out the aim, what is the policy meant to achieve, and high quality development being one of them. I think it probably goes back to the point I was making earlier about what does high quality development look like. And so if high quality development in this respect looks like a development that has met a standard that either is the Building for a Healthy Life standard or an equivalent one, that's the way you get to it.
Okay. Yes,
It's following that thread through.
okay.
Can I come back to the HBF on this one? I think we have moved forward a little bit on the points that you raised, and I'd be grateful if you've got any other points that you'd like to make on this, which perhaps can help us and the council get to get to where we need to in terms of this policy.
Well, our principle is that we support building for a healthy life, and we were instrumental in its development. But we have always seen it as a tool, as best practice, and that it's primarily should be voluntary as opposed to an actual policy requirement, and therefore we would prefer to see it referenced in the supporting text as opposed to within the policy itself. And as I say, the building for a health, the development of building for a healthy life has evolved and moved on from building for life and building for life 12. So building for a healthy life is a process of self-assessment, which all development councils, local communities, etc., can use to assess a development, and therefore we see the self-assessment aspect as the key component. The commendation is about it is really something that's been developed primarily if a developer were wishing to advertise the scheme as building for a healthy life with a commendation in their marketing literature. So it's something beyond the self-assessment, and not all developers may wish to do that, and therefore they wouldn't be registering to do it, and they wouldn't be paying a fee, and they wouldn't be having it assessed by a third party to achieve accommodation. That's not to say that a self-assessment is in any way lesser than a scheme that's been through the accommodation process. It's just that's something slightly different. It's about whether you want to use it in the advertising campaigns, etc., and you want to budget, etc., use the logo, etc. So our position is that the council should be using it as the tool as a self-assessment, and it shouldn't necessarily be a policy requirement. It should be, but perhaps further in supporting text, guiding developers towards using it.
Yeah, I think we're getting to a point that the council were referring to. I think they're talking about using it within the supporting text. But you could submit, I'm not suggesting anybody would do this, but you could submit a Building for a Healthy Life assessment, and which shows that you perhaps got, to use Mr Everard's vocabulary, a lot of reds on it. So in terms of the council, they want something that ensures that the Healthy Life assessment, I think, is meaningful. And so therefore, a self-assessment which shows that if they did submit for marketing purposes, for accommodation, they would be reasonably assured of getting it, but that would still be part of a self-assessment and not separately assessed. I think that's
Yes,
as I understand it.
I'm not 100% certain though how the council would be able to judge. How is it going to judge that it would get accommodation? You see what I mean? If because it's a traffic light system. So are they? How would you how would you judge it? You know, are you going to, as a council, trying to say, well, it has to achieve a certain number of greens, or over a certain number of reds, it's not acceptable, because then that gets very difficult, because it depends on site specifics. Certain sites might never achieve 100% greens because of the nature of the site. So I'm not 100% certain how the council is planning to judge between the self-assessment and achieving accommodation.
Okay, I'll come back to Mr. Everard on this, because I think you did mention some of these criteria before. It might have been when we were rudely interrupted by the noise outside. So.
Yes, I think it was, sir. Yeah. Yes, we were also looking at making a further change to main modification 0, which would be a modification to paragraph 5.5 of the plan. And we were looking at saying something along the lines of, there are 12 considerations which need to be taken into account in the areas of design and placemaking. The 12 considerations include elements such as natural connections, well-defined streets and spaces, and green infrastructure. To be eligible for a building for a healthy life accommodation, a development needs to secure at least 9 green lights out of the 12 considerations, and no red lights.
So they're not looking for 100% green lights. There is some flexibility within that. And that would be in the supporting text.
Yes, sir.
And you're talking about accommodation there, not about the determination of a planning application.
Yes.
Because they're two separate things.
Yes.
And
Can I come back to Ms. Green on that?
Yes, I mean, as you say, they're not seeking 100%. I think perhaps if we perhaps see the exact wordings in modifications as they come through.
And you can give us.
Yeah, of course. Yes, sir.
Thank you. And again, a bit like when Mr. Lewis talked to Litchfields this morning, it'd be useful if you could liaise with the HBF over this to come to ensure there's some agreement, what's the statement of common ground on the wording there. That would be useful.
Of course, sir. Yeah.
I have no other points on this, but I'm looking at the time, wondering whether
We probably
we're
do.
approaching time for mid-morning.
I think we do need one, yeah. So I've got one question on the proposed modifications, but we'll deal with that as soon as we come back. If we have a break now, it's 11:16, so if we can adjourn the hearings now until, shall we say 11:30? Or
35.
11:35.
It just reminds me when I did training on local plan inquiries, and I was on